So now we are on the second set of notes for our biological molecules. We'll be covering proteins, we'll be covering nucleic acids, and then we'll be covering enzymes, which are a type of protein. So first we're going to cover nucleic acids, and nucleic acids are made up of nucleotides. So nucleotides are considered the monomer of nucleic acids, and that's pretty important to remember. The polymer, the large molecule, would be actually the nucleic acid. So here we have an example of a nucleotide, just one of the units that is bonded together to create this larger nucleic acid. So every nucleotide will have three basic parts: a phosphate group, and that's represented here, it's PO4, or it's a lot of times will be represented as a circle or a dot in models or drawings of a DNA structure or RNA. Then we have a sugar unit named deoxyribose, and here we have it, and that's technically a carb, so we do have carbs embedded into our DNA, but you don't really need to focus on that right now. And then the really important part is one of four nitrogen bases. So in DNA we have four. We actually have a little bit more, but in our cells because of RNA and ATP. But for DNA there are four basic nitrogen bases. We have A, T, C, G, and we'll discuss a little bit more in depth about DNA a little bit later. So the primary function of nucleic acids, the main thing that these do, is to store information. So your DNA is basically information on how to make you, what your cells need in order to continue life, to continue the organisms that you are, and all of the necessary building blocks, functions that it needs to do are encoded in this DNA. RNA is also used as well, and we'll talk about the functions of RNA a little bit later. But this is probably the easiest one to remember because Na, nucleic acid, is both in DNA and RNA. That's what it stands for, nucleic acid. For DNA, it would be deoxyribonucleic acid. For RNA, it would be just ribonucleic acid. So these nucleotides are used to also distribute energy more efficiently. So here we have one glucose, and glucose has so much energy stored in its bonds that the cells can actually make 36 ATP molecules. And ATP molecules are the power or the energy that the energy packets that your cell makes in order for it to be used for different cellular functions. So the ATP molecule can deliver the smaller amounts of energy that are needed so the energy is not wasted. If we were to get our energy directly from glucose, it'd be way too much energy for any function of the cell, and the energy from those bonds would be wasted as soon as we would go through them. You would need to be constantly eating in order for your cells to have enough energy. So ATP is considered a nucleotide. Instead of one of the phosphate, like all the other nucleotides like in DNA or in RNA, these have three phosphate groups. The bonds between these extra phosphate groups are where we get our energy. So every time one of those bonds is broken, it releases energy, and that's what our cells use. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, but you can remember that it gives cells all the power. So just remember ATP means energy, power. So now we're going to talk about proteins. And proteins is a big part of your body. So they are made up of amino acids. And the larger molecule, or the polymer, is called a protein. So amino acids would be considered the monomer, and here we have one example of an amino acid, and you can see it's other amino acids repeated in the protein. So we can also call proteins polypeptides, and the reason we call them that is because the bond that holds the amino acids together in a protein is called a peptide bond, and you can see that right there. So proteins are the most diverse groups of biomolecules, and they perform the largest variety of functions in the cell. So while carbs were the main part were to provide energy for the cell, lipids were to create cellular membranes, and nucleic acids are to store information. Proteins have a bunch of different uses that our cells need them for. So small proteins we will call polypeptides, and this is because the bond between the amino acid is the peptide bond. These proteins can be used to transport molecules through membranes. They attack invading germs. They carry oxygen through the blood. They send signals through your body. So your body has a bunch of different types of protein. The most important, maybe, type of protein we call enzymes. And these enzymes are in every single cell, and they speed up chemical reactions inside the cell. And here we have an example. Here are some computer simulated diagrams of some enzymes, and then we have some drawings here. So what these enzymes again do, they speed up chemical reactions, but they don't change in the process. So this means that the enzyme is used over and over again in the cell. So it's basically like a little factory. It can either break up or put different molecules together. So here's our before. The substrate enters the active site in the enzyme, and that's the really important part of the enzyme, the active site. What we call the molecule it's a substrate. So once the enzyme shape changes as the substrate bonds, and we'll call that the enzyme substrate complex, then the enzyme, if it's going to break it up, it'll break it up and create the products, and then these products will leave the active site of the enzyme. So enzymes can break apart or digest large molecules into smaller pieces. So if we have a large strand of DNA, we can have an enzyme break it down if the cell needs to. Or enzymes can also synthesize. So synthesize is a fancy word which means put together. So they can synthesize large molecules by putting smaller pieces together. So if we need to create a strand of DNA, for example, and we have a bunch of nucleotides, an enzyme can put those together. So enzymes are kind of tricky, and when we talk about when they lower the energy, we're talking about activation energy. So every chemical reaction requires some energy to get it started, and this energy is called activation energy. So enzymes speed up the reactions by lowering the activation energy, so needing in order for the chemical reaction to actually get started. The reactants, or the raw materials that enzymes start with, are called this enzyme substrate. So just like we said before, the substrate is the beginning or the reactant of the reaction that's going to happen in the enzyme. The substrates will always attach to the active site. So remember that active site is where the enzyme will digest or synthesize any molecules that it needs to. Because the active site is designed to attach to a very specific substrate, cells must have a different enzyme for every chemical reaction. So your body has a bunch of different types of enzymes that do very specific things. So if your cell is breaking up and making glucose or something, or if it's breaking down any type of protein, it's very specific to that type of protein. It's a molecule, whatever it needs to do. You have one for breaking down milk, sugars, you have one for breaking down like pasta. So there's a bunch of different enzymes that you have in your body that are very specific to the type of molecule that they work on. One quick thing that you kind of have to remember about these enzymes, a lot of times they will end in ase. So, like for example, the enzyme that breaks down lactose, the sugar found in milk, will be lactase. So ase is kind of like the suffix for the enzyme names. And again, I just want to remind you that all of our four classes of biomolecules or biological molecules are considered organic compounds. So carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins are all considered organic compounds because they have carbon in it. So when you create your foldable, you will need to put the elements. You're going to notice all of them have carbon in it. And the reason is carbon is the base of life here on Earth, and that's what we consider if a molecule has carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, then we consider it an organic compound. Alright, so we are done with our second set of notes. This one was a little bit longer. Make sure that you wrote down any definitions and important information, and don't forget to put 2 questions or 3 questions that you have for our discussion tomorrow.